Kia ora koutou and good evening everyone. My name is Ian Watt. I'm a board member of Samesame but Different. I'd like to welcome you to this special online book launch for Douglas Lloyd Jenkins' first novel, Shelter, published by Bateman Books. Before we begin, it's important to thank our sponsors, Creative New Zealand, Auckland Pride, the Peter Rule Foundation, Auckland Council Libraries, Unity Books, the Rainbow New Zealand Charitable Trust, and the Coalition for Books. It's due to their support that we can bring you this festival of free events celebrating LGBTQI+ writers from Aotearoa. Tonight's event is a bit different. We were originally going to have a traditional book launch to celebrate the publication of Douglas's novel. You know, a glass of wine, some canapes, a couple of speeches, hugs and kisses all round. Well, we can't do the wine and kisses on Zoom, but I hope you have a glass to hand, as I have, that you can raise to Douglas in honour of the occasion tonight. We've turned the usual kind of book launch into a Q&A with Douglas, and I think he will read a little from the novel as well. Your host this evening is Jeremy Hanson, an old friend of Samesame and a former board member. You'll also have the opportunity to type in some questions on the chat if you so wish. So without further ado, welcome back, Jeremy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Kia ora, everybody. Kia ora, Douglas. It's really nice to be here this evening. And because this is the launch where we'd kind of, in IRL, we'd be wandering around the room with glasses of wine and things, as Ian said. It'd be good if we had a kind of slightly loose structure tonight. So please feel free to pop the questions in the chat and we will address those as they come up. But firstly, welcome to you, Douglas. I first became aware of your work actually as a reader of what was then called Home and Entertaining magazine, and I later became the editor of that magazine, and we worked together on many things, and it was fantastic to feature your writing. Before I started at Home magazine, you had won the Montana Book Awards Prize for Nonfiction for your book At Home, The Century of New Zealand Design, which to me remains a real touchstone of New Zealand design and architecture through the modernist period. And that brings me to my first question, which is, what made you want to transition into writing fiction?
Interesting choice of words. In some ways, I felt I've come to the end of what I wanted to do in nonfiction. I've always been on the creative end of nonfiction writing. Even my histories are very interpretive. And the books that I wanted to write, to be honest, people didn't want to publish. And the books people wanted to publish, I didn't want to write. And so I have always been interested in writing fiction. I have written pieces before, but I just decided this was the time to move into fiction.
Did the story come first, or did the decision to write fiction?
Well, they're kind of related. I think I was of the belief you had to write short stories to write a novel. But there's an old adage in writing: if you don't read it, don't write it. I don't much like short stories, but I thought that was how you had to start. I'd written short stories, I'd entered them in competitions. I hadn't really got anywhere, sat down to write another one, and basically realized it wasn't a short story, it was a novel. So I kept on going. And in actual fact, the short story I was writing, I think one line of it might exist in the novel. The plot of this novel overtook that short story. And I think one of the things I've heard from other novelists is that you get a voice in your head, which is your character, that has a story they want to reveal. And really, for the first time in my life, I had that experience of a voice in my head, and then multiple voices saying, we've got something you need to know. And it was very interesting. When I finished writing the novel, you know, I played with a little bit to do certain things, but then the voices stopped because they felt their story had been told. So I thought I knew I had a project.
Did you find that process enjoyable?
Yes, I did. It's all consuming and it is exhausting when people think a lot of people say they'd like to write a novel. It's an extraordinarily exhausting project, because in nonfiction, if you're researching something, you can move in and out of your research, and you can do it in phases. But I think with a novel, you're creating an entire world, and you have to immerse yourself in that world, and you have to stay there. And so it's not somewhere you can easily come in and go out of. So it's a lovely process, but it's exhausting and thrilling.
We talked about transitioning from nonfiction to fiction, but I was also interested in reading the book about how the subject matter to some degree remains similar. There are through lines, particularly these passions of yours in architecture and design. And I wondered if you were kind of consciously carrying those over, or if they were always going to be kind of an integral part of what you were going to create in the fictional world.
Yeah, I can't really imagine myself writing fiction without reference to architecture and design, but that's also because I think architecture and design are integral to our lives. That's how I've always written. I've always written with that idea that these things are our lives, so it was never going to disappear. But I also think that I am, in some ways, this is not a novel about architecture, but it's an approach that's the same as my non-fiction writing. I'm trying to get people to think about the urban environment. And now I'm using fiction as a sneakier way in. When you're a writer and you're asked, or when you ask what you do and you say, I'm a writer, the next question is usually, what do you write about? And outside the community of architects and designers, when I say I write about art, architecture, and design, the blinds come down. They don't go, oh, well, where would I get a copy of your book? They just, that's just like moving on. And so I thought, well, fiction's another way to get in, to getting people that aren't in the architecture and design community to think about these things. I've always written for magazines like Home that are highly accessible, because I wanted to get the ideas into people's heads, and fiction's just a new way into the same platform, same story, new platform, different journey.
And so how did you choose this particular story? There's these characters who are, well, the central character is a queer man who's kind of navigating this city. Why was it his story that you wanted to put all this work into telling?
I wanted to talk about the trajectory of a kind of, in some ways, ordinary person who finds place in Auckland and finds a place that he belonged even in a bigger sense. So Joe, the main character, he finds his place in Auckland. He creates himself family, which is something that gay men in particular do. It is in many ways, it's a lot. I think all first novels are a bit autobiographical. I found my way into a career that no one had planned. One of the things about Joe is that he just tends to fall into opportunities. He's ambitious, but he doesn't know where his ambition lies, and so opportunities happen, and he takes advantage of them. So I thought that was interesting. There was never any idea that the novel would be anywhere else but Auckland. I think that's my love of this city is something that I wanted to write about.
I'm interested in the fact that you didn't choose a profession such as architect or designer for Joe, and I wanted to ask you why that was the case.
You slipped that question to me earlier on, and I've been thinking quite a lot about it. Because Joe is driven by opportunity, he's not an egomaniac. And without getting the entire architectural profession offside, a senior architect said to me, what was I working on now? And I said, I'm writing a novel. And this was just like we met in the street, and he said, oh, is it about me? and or am I the lead character? And I thought only an architect would say that. You know, you meet a nice accountant on the street and he wouldn't say, am I the central character in your novel? And I didn't want that sort of ambition and that sort of ego at the heart of my character. Joe starts out life as a builder. He grows professionally and intellectually and emotionally, but I didn't want that overbearing ego that does quite often appear in architecture.
This is a bit of a swerve, but why do you think it does often appear in architecture? Because that is, I agree, a really peculiar response to the news that you're writing a novel.
Look, to be a successful architect, you have to be so many things, and you have to have such terrific self-confidence. And I'm actually working on something at the moment, and it's about that other ego-driven profession. It's about a chef, you know, he's got big opinions, but he also suffers from crippling anxiety. So it's that, you know, those big professions that demand a lot from an individual person. You have to be a particular type of character to survive in them. And I think Joe's a more sensitive soul.
It was interesting to me how Joe also navigates this journey of his own queerness, in a sense, in that he knows that he is at the beginning of the book. And there is some angst around that, but that angst kind of pretty quickly evaporates in that sense as he finds his way. And I wondered how that mirrored your own experience, or if you were creating a slightly idealized world for him.
I think, you know, the book opens in 1994. And I think one of the things is that Joe very quickly forms a relationship with this other boy called Leo, and they have their own world, and they're so obsessed with each other that they only have their world. So they're not out there being politically active. They're not out there being involved in the community. They've created a world that is just them. And that is one of the tensions in the book, is that what happens when that world no longer exists. And so Joe has to deal with being publicly queer later on, but he does avoid it in his early years. And, you know, I think if you could just look down on a cloud and see Joe and Leo together, they do come across in some ways as just two blokes getting on with things. You know, they're both builders. They're not, if you like, under suspicion. They're just getting on with being in love. And
at the same time as Joe is developing, the city, Auckland, in which he lives, is developing too, and he's playing a part in that. Auckland, as Emily said in the chat, the book feels a bit like a love letter to the city, and especially to Auckland's potential, but also its messiness, because it's really clear that this is not a perfect city that they're living in, whatever that city might be. So I wanted to ask you about how you constituted Auckland in this book, and if you were indeed thinking of the city as kind of a character.
Very, very much Auckland was always going to be a character. I think that, as I say, I never considered setting it anywhere else. I was once told many years ago, probably 20 more years ago, by a publisher that you can't write books about Auckland because Aucklanders don't read and the rest of the country won't buy them. And that had sat niggling in the back of my head for a long time. And also there's this idea that even Aucklanders, they tend to run away. Like when there's a holiday, they all leave town. And Auckland, I don't think is ever going to develop properly as a city until we stay. And more people do stay, and especially, you know, through this lockdown thing. So it was an opportunity to get people to look at their city and to think about it. And even though the very intense parts of the book that are about the city are set in the early 90s, that can apply today. And I was very careful to have two specific settings in the book that Emily Place and St. Patrick's Square that are very much still there, so that people can sort of experience them. But I also talk about parts that have actually completely disappeared.
You're also introducing the city at a really tumultuous time in its history. It's kind of, there's been a whole lot of demolition in the go-go days of the 80s. There's been the share market crash. It's this very suburban place where the heart of the city is kind of slightly hollowed out to some degree. Could you talk a little bit about the state that you introduce Auckland in and how that progresses through the book in terms of a character arc?
Well, I knew the city first in the early 80s, before that big flash of demolition. And then in the 90s, there was another big lot of demolition. So I sort of started the book in the space between. So Leo, the older character, can remember the older city, but Joe, the younger character, is about to see the ongoing demolition. And what happens with Auckland is there are these bursts of activity, and you can tell by the number of cranes you can count when you drive, down the motorway. It goes from 3 to 20 at different times. And so I wanted to catch the city in one of those lull moments. And there's a moment in the book where Leo gifts the city to Joe. He says, Joe, it's yours, take it. And that's something he takes to heart. And, I often think it's the casual things that people say to us that we often take to heart. And Joe takes that to heart, and he makes the idea that Auckland is his city and he has a responsibility to it. The motif of his life, professional life, in a way.
Are you also then saying to people that you would like them, your readers, or you would like it if more people took on the kind of responsibility, not literally, but figuratively, that Joe does to kind of make their cities better?
Yeah, well, Leo turns the city into a romantic proposition for Joe. And I think one of my intentions in this book is to romanticize Auckland. So in nonfiction, I have to deal with the facts of a building. Here I can deal with the emotions of a building. And so, yes, I want people to connect to buildings and to love buildings and to care about them. I saw a billboard the other day. It was for a bank, and it said, all businesses matter to someone, so all businesses matter to us. And I thought, if you took out business and put in building, all buildings matter to someone, so all buildings should matter to us. Then we'd start to get the sense of Auckland as a romantic city that's held together by emotions, and those emotions are stored in buildings. And we think twice about just saying, oh, well, I've never heard of that architect, or oh, that's only from the 60s, it can get pulled down. You start a more emotional map. And I think we've been rather too clinical about what we consider important about Auckland. It's the whole that matters, not individual parts.
What is it that you love about the city?
It's gentleness, it's openness. It's, I think it's a kind of sexy sort of city. I think that does have a wonderful built heritage. There are still beautiful things to be found. We just need, I've been looking at some of those buildings since I was a teenager, and I think it's very rare for when people ask me about a building and I tell them for them to not be interested, if you know what I mean. We have a craving to understand our city better, I think. Auckland needs people to love it. And the fiction helps, well, that's great.
It's interesting that you're seeing the city through this kind of built lens. And I wanted to ask you how you learned to see this way, and which has turned into you writing this way.
I think it does go back to an autobiographical moment in that I moved from the North Shore to the central city in 1981 as a teenager, going to first year of university. Up till then, my visits to the city had been things like to go to the big farmers, or the occasional Queen Street trip. So I suddenly was living in the CBD. And back in the 80s, the only thing that was open after about 8 o'clock at night was the all-night dairy in Ponsonby Road. So if you wanted the 80s, a packet of cigarettes or some potato chips or something, you had to walk to Ponsonby, and it was like an hour's walk. And so my flatmate and I would do these midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning walks across the city to buy something inane. But you got to see the city and you got to look at it and talk about it. I've always been a natural historian, so I was always interested in what those buildings were and are. So I had that knowledge of the city. So that's where the some of that impetus comes from.
How do you feel about the city now? Because it's at this time, well, Auckland often feels like this, I suppose, but it's in this period where there's a historic housing crisis. The city is straining at its boundaries. It's become, by car at least, quite difficult for many people to get around. There's kind of stark inequity in many places, and Queen Street, if you've wandered down there lately, is kind of in a period of crisis, you could describe it as. Some of those blocks are, you know, almost 80% empty shops. So what's your feeling about it now, and does that feeling contain optimism, or are you pessimistic about it?
As I said, you know, these rushes of development and demolition and even forward and backward movement in Auckland, they come in pulses. So I'm old enough now to go, here we go again. What concerns me is that having damaged the inner city, we may be using a housing crisis to now damage the inner city suburbs. You know, I don't believe that demolishing a house in one of the inner city suburbs, you know, a Remuera, a Mount Eden, a Devonport, putting up a block of 6 or 8 townhouses that we're going to sell off at $2 million each is going to do anything but a housing crisis. You know, I think it's important that this book, Auckland is a character, Auckland, it's a love story. I suppose I wasn't trying to write a book that was about the planning of the city, if you know what I mean. You know, I have villains in the book, but none of them are planners.
But the book also suggests that the love affair with the city endures across decades, and I presume in that case it's still enduring for you. Yes,
I spent 10 years working in Hawke's Bay, but Auckland's home. I'm actually a statistical rarity in that I was born in Auckland. This is my home, and I will defend it. And it's very interesting. If you jump into a taxi cab anywhere in the country and you say you're from Auckland, you will get some fairly harsh opinions about Auckland from the taxi driver. For the 10 years that I lived in Hawke's Bay, and I could say I lived in Napier, taxi drivers go, I love Napier. Haven't been there for 30 years, but I love it. They haven't been to Auckland for 40 years either, but they hate it.
It's a really interesting polarity, isn't it? And it almost seems like in the book you're consciously trying to counter that.
Yeah. Look, it's an unabashed love story. The whole novel is about being in love and dealing with its consequences. And so what are the consequences of being in love with a city? It's going to be a fairly bumpy ride.
I wanted to ask you about the relationship between Jo and Leo, because, and you tell me how far you want to take this without spoilers being there, but it's complicated for a number of reasons, partially to do with Leo's own fluidity, I suppose, in his sexuality. What made you want to write that character, and what part does that ambiguity play in the book?
I wanted to write a complex relationship. Leo's character does actually come out of something someone once said to me. We all know these people. I have a friend who's a lovely, sweet, sensitive guy, straight boy, and he's often, people think he's gay because he's pleasant and polite and lovely. And I asked him, and he said, no, I'm not. But if I fell in love with the right man, it wouldn't be a question for me. And I thought about that for a long time. You know, here's a straight person that just says, well, if the right man came along. And I wanted to kind of write that character because Leo is someone who, he doesn't like labels. And he meets somebody and he falls for them and he takes it as far as he can go.
That kind of ease is fascinating to me, given the difficulty so many of us and so many other people have in kind of coming to terms with their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so was that part of your objective or part of the pleasure of writing this character, is that he's genuinely unbothered by these boundaries and these labels? Yes,
Leo tries to be unbothered by much. He tries to be philosophical, he tries to be laid back, you know, although he's got a whole lot of issues of his own. He's trying to be the cool guy. I was very determined not to write a book that was dominated by the coming out process. We've seen a lot of them. There's been so many of them. And I was very conscious of the fact that coming out isn't a big deal to some people now. It might have been to our generation, but it's not anymore. I wanted to be able to move those things forward. So yeah, for me, Leo is the archetypical, he's the archetypical laid back, cool dude who not even sexuality is going to ruffle his feathers.
I wanted to talk to you also about the sex in the book, which is really great, I think, and also but avoided by so many writers, any sex, but especially gay sex. How did you tackle the writing of that, and how did you know where you got it to a place where it felt right?
Yeah, it was interesting. I just wanted, yeah, for a first-time writer, I think writing sex is really scary. So I tried to err on the side of imagination. I wanted just to write something that was sort of gentle and, you know, allowed two people to come together. I don't think they took me any longer than any other part of the book to write, though I had a very interesting conversation with Louise, my editor. It's questions like, where is this hand? and what, is this up or is this up? So that was, it did need a little clarification, but I couldn't bear to write a gay man's love story that there was no sex in, because that would also seem to me like writing that comes from a different period.
But it makes me think of the writer Garth Greenwell, who wrote a really interesting essay about the inclusion of gay sex in his books and how there's quite a lot of it, and how people, some reviewers have found that kind of difficult to process. And his response is that so much reading, sex is eradicated from it, and our literature doesn't kind of reflect the presence that sex plays in many of our lives. Were you kind of working consciously in that sense by the sounds of it? Yes,
I knew it had to be there. You know, it's a big part of everyone's life. New Zealanders particularly tend to avoid writing about it, I think, and talking about it. But it is a big driver in life. These guys are 21 and 24. So Joe, right from the beginning, he talks about wanting to be in love, but he talks, you know, he wants sex as well. When you're that age, there's not actually a lot else on your mind. So I was very conscious of the need for that. But I also wanted to write, you know, this book to me is about a kind of integration. We've been fighting in the gay community for integration and to be included for a long time. And so I wanted to write a book that everybody might read, that wasn't alienating, that a bookseller could say, I think you might like this, but, you know, it didn't have to sit in a particular section in the bookshop, because the book is about love. It's about love and romance, and it's about being in love and the consequences when love goes wrong. So it's about certain universals that transcend the gay experience.
The book is now out in the world, of course, and so with those ambitions for it in mind, I wondered how you found, what the response has been like for you, but how you find the difference between putting a book of fiction and non-fiction out in the world, if there are any.
Yeah, one of the things that's about non-fiction, particularly if you're writing in a profession like architecture or design, is that people open the index and they see if they're in it, and then they read the bit about themselves and make the decision about whether they're going to buy it. And you can't do that in fiction. Yeah, look, it's out in the world. One of the things I found really interesting is that I had feedback has started to trickle in from people. And one of the things I really find interesting is the non-gay reader or the non-LGBTQI plus reader who is having to say to me, I'm a non-gay and I love this book. because they don't really have words for who they are. And I wanted a book that the non-gays might enjoy reading, and they might get into how we think a little bit more. And I also wanted it to be a contemporary book. And one friend of mine said, oh, this is so much how gay men behave, this book. It's like how we behave now. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, you know, when we break up, we totally lose our shit. And someone else who's not in the community said, oh, we do that too. And I thought that was quite nice.
I'm interested in that need for that reader to spell out where he was coming from. Where do you think that desire comes from? They could just write a fan letter without specifying their own sexual orientation.
I think that's, you know, if you think like a bookseller for a moment, a lot of bookstores have had LGBTQI sections, and they've probably had an audience that they've known they could channel there. And this book is designed for a much broader audience. And a lot of those people will be reading gay fiction for the first time. And that is a big step for some people. And, you know, I think people think there's probably some horrors lurking in there, and when they find it's not there. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, you know, how we all frame ourselves. Because in this day and age, I think everyone is framing themselves in lots of different ways.
It's interesting that you took this responsibility on consciously, and I wondered what you're kind of trying to say or communicate in doing so. Obviously, there's the advantage of thinking like a bookseller and reaching a wider audience, but it sounds like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you know, the same but different festivals have been talking about the idea of legacy. And when you think about people that have gone before you, they do certain things in certain ways. And what does that mean to us? I think there's been a generation of New Zealand gay writers who have been very much, they grew up in that 50s, 60s post-war period, and they've written about the difficulty of that. And so the legacy of some of those writers are the coming out novels, the novels about difficulty and trauma and the inability to fit in and trying to carve out your own place. Their legacy allows us to move on. You know, they've done their work. We now get to move gay writing into a different place. And I compare this to television. If you sit down to a good television series now, there's going to be a gay character lurking somewhere. It doesn't make that gay television, but there's different levels of, you know, there's some pretty terrible gay characters out there that are fairly one-dimensional, but there's been some extremely good gay characters in mainstream television. And so in some ways I was trying to write more like that inclusive, move gay writing out of gothic horrors about trauma, about unwelcome relatives, about the difficulty of coming out, about bullying in school, and move it to a new place, and for it to be happier and more expansive, because, you know, there are an awful lot of happy gay men out there who are having quite nice lives. Thank you.
Here's a question from Philip in the chat. The plot sounds rather filmic, which I agree it is. And do you think it would work as a movie?
Well, it's always every writer's lovely idea that it would be a movie. Look, I suppose I do think very visually. So it is a little filmic. And there are a few moments that I can see in the book that would make good episode endings. What's going to happen next week?
Would you write the screenplay?
Oh, I think that's a whole different profession.
You were talking just before about lineage and about legacy, and I wondered if there were particular books that inspired this one. And I'm thinking particularly of this kind of blend of character and city and architecture, and it's a very different mood. But I was thinking of J.G. Ballard and the way modernism kind of weaves through his books. What were kind of touch points for you as you were constructing this world?
Well, I think, particularly for my generation, you can't go past Armistead Maupin and his Tales of the City, which are very much about San Francisco and very much about being gay. I have a real love for 19th century French fiction, Balzac and Zola, and they're always writing about cities and the politics and people of those cities, and a lot of, going back to how we started this conversation about my interest in architecture and design, there are a lot of books and a lot of literature in the world where architecture of a city and the importance of objects is very, very integrated. New Zealand writing perhaps less so. There's a New Zealand novelist called Graham Aitken who wrote a book called Vanity Fair, and he lives in Sydney. And I remember reading Vanity Fair, and it really disturbed me. And I felt that it was like product placement. It was like he got out of his BMW Series 232 9.6 litre coupe and looked at his Rolex such and such before walking across this footpath in his Gucci sandals. And I remember thinking, this is terrible. But that book stayed with me and stayed with me. And I reread it again some years later, and I realised that was Sydney. You know, you couldn't write Sydney without that obsession with objects, and that he wasn't being sponsored by BMW. It was and I've really come to really love that book, because they are books that understand the meaning of objects and understand the meaning of city.
Mike's asked in the chat, who in the book deserves their own novel? Which characters do you think are part of the spin-off?
One of the things that I wanted to write in the novel was how Joe constructs his own family, and he has this intergenerational family. And one of the characters is a retired, slightly nutty glove maker called Gerald, who's lived through all the harshness before liberation, or before law reform, and even before the gay liberation of the 70s. You know, he's a much older man. And I do think Gerald's someone I'm still thinking about. You know, he's a man who spent his life fronting a business through the 50s and 60s as a gay man. So I think about him quite a lot.
This is a good question from Sarah, which I'd like to know the answer to. Can you please talk a bit about the meaning of the title of the book and of the cover? Oh,
well, Shelter, look, it did have quite a long gestation, that title, but in the end, the characters are, I think, all looking for that very thing, shelter. They're looking for protection. And, you know, it's got quite a large cast of characters, really. And they are all in their own way looking for this shelter, this notion of family, and they're all looking for love. There is in the last part of the book significant building that plays quite a major role. And one of the things I say in the book is that it would remind you of the big windows at the end of St. Kevin's Arcade in Auckland. So the cover is very much the designer's interpretation of what it would be to look into that building. And yeah, so that's kind of where the cover comes from.
Does the apartment actually exist that you write about in the book? I was curious to know.
It exists partially. The building exists. The apartment itself is imagined.
Yeah, I found myself on Google Maps trolling that street to see which building it could be.
I don't know if you can like burn a hole in Google Maps, but I think everyone who has read this book so far has trolled that street. The building is real. The apartment is imagined.
This is a good question that's come through again from Mike. What's your dream heritage apartment building in Auckland?
Look, the great apartment buildings are the ones built between World War I and World War II. They're all over the place, from Courtville, which you lived in at one point, through to the Newman flats, which are now, I think, are PhD student flats at the top of in Simon Street. The beautiful flats in Grays Avenue that were built in the 30s and 40s. But some of the best heritage flats are not in apartment buildings. They're the old caretakers' flats built on the roofs of some of the more generic 20s, 30s skyscrapers. So they often had live-in janitors, and on their flat roofs, there are these hidden little houses. They're actually dotted all over the city. That would be, if I was gonna find somewhere I wanted to live in the CBD, that's what I'd be looking for.
Douglas, now this book's out in the world, what's the next project for you?
Well, as I sort of mentioned before, I am working on another novel about a chef with anxiety issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm about a third of the way through that. It's, I think, very, very different. But I kind of feel I've enjoyed this process. So I think, I'm going to have a real go at it. I feel that it's fiction now. I don't have any non-fiction projects on the boil.
The book, you said, is very different. In what ways is it so, and what are you finding about the way your fiction writing practice is developing or expanding?
The new one, which doesn't yet have a title, has a first-person narrator because he's a giant ego. So that's quite a learning experience, how to write that big voice without it annoying all the readers. And to be inside his head from a single point of view. It's also a book that is a narrative that's told over 2 different time zones. So that's kind of tricky. But, again, that wasn't something I particularly planned. It's just something I started. I realized that he was going to be a big voice.
And do you have a deadline?
No. People have got to buy this one first.
That's a good point for us to finish, Douglas. And I want to say, firstly, congratulations on the book being published, and a huge thank you for joining us today, to you and our readers. And good luck with the continued promotion of the book and the writing of the next one. It's really great to see you on this new phase.
Cool. Thank you, Jeremy.
Mate wa. Thank you, Douglas, and thank you everybody else for joining us.
Okay.
Ka kite.